Tonight I want to discuss for about an hour or so the issue of land use and sugar, trying to answer the question why and how sugar dominated. Sugar for Barbados is an amazing crop. It is amazing because by 1660 it had eclipsed all other crops in Barbados. It had eclipsed cotton, tobacco, indigo, ginger. And not only that, it had profound changes within the society, within the economy, so profound that historians use the term sugar revolution to describe those changes. Thirdly, for 300 years, from about 1660 to 1960, it thoroughly dominated the landscape. It thoroughly dominated the economy and the society. So it is amazing in those three regards. Tonight, as I discuss this crop, sugarcane and sugar, I want to start with what I call the prevailing antithesis. Then I will go to the thesis. Thirdly, I'm going to illustrate sugar's dominance in the economy and the society. And fourth, this is a key part of the lecture, I will try to answer the question why sugar has been so dominant for such a long period of time. Fifthly, I want to look at how it dominated and the impact of that dominance, how it affected the society, how it caused wealth within the community. And finally, I'm going to come back to analyze what I call two competing perspectives and share a few concerns at the end. Let us start with the prevailing view on sugar and its contribution to economy and society. In 1951, the editor of the Advocate Yearbook had this to say about what he called King Sugar. I quote, "For 300 years, sugar has been king in Barbados. Not, as is sometimes said without contradiction, in ill-informed quarters because of any vested interests which obstruct diversification of agriculture, but because no other crop, and they had been tried, tobacco, cotton, groundnuts, bananas, tomatoes, ground provisions, etc., can give so much well-paid employment to so many." This is his view, that no other crop can give so much well-paid employment to so many. So the writer rejects the notion that vested interests within the community obstructed diversification, and therefore that is why sugar continued. He rejected that notion. And he went on to say that sugar dominated because of what he calls intrinsic characteristics. What came out of it? The fact that sugar, he says, does not impoverish the soil. The fact that sugar provides its own fuel. So we have a view, therefore, that sugar has dominated not because of the elite class in the community, but because of the characteristics of sugar. So there's a popular view, therefore, that the sugar industry has been the salvation of Barbados. And there are some people in the 60s and 70s, people who have worked in the industry, and people who benefited from the industry as well, who have a sentimental attachment to the sugar industry and to sugar, and they will tell you that this is the backbone of the economy. This is the crop that made Barbados what it is today. As a matter of fact, we find this view, this popular view, in Stetson Wilshire's song, Sugar Made Us Free, in 1992. He won the Calypso Monarch for that year. 1982, sorry, not 92, 82. I'm not going to attempt to sing it today, but I will give you a few of the words. Verse 5, he says, Bajans, wake up and see the progress we made through this industry. Sugar is we, and that is a fact. That's why today we can be seen on the map. That fight is done, but the battle is on. How So there's a popular view, therefore, that sugar built the nation. My view is yes, but in a limited way. Our national heritage, and will help to strengthen our tourism project. And led to an there is not a foot of land in Barbados that is not employed, even to the sea. Not a foot of land that is not employed, even to the sea. Now, this is several years after the settlement. The planters had cleared, using enslaved labor, had cleared the forest, they'd cleared the area, and they had gone into an intensive form of agriculture, cultivating nearly every considerable piece of land, arable land, that could be found. So that is 1670. Fast forward to 1837. Two abolitionists, Joseph Sturge and Thomas Harvey, they come to the Caribbean, they write their book, The West Indies, in 1837, and they had this to say about Barbados. 1837, the land was entirely occupied by cane grounds, fields of guinea corn, plots of yam, etc. Entirely occupied by cane grounds. A few years later, 1842, a police magistrate had this to say about the impact of sugar and its dominance. 1842. There is not in the whole island a spot of wasteland fit for cultivation. And as the land is principally divided into plantations, the proprietors are not likely to sell off small plots for that purpose. And there being no public lands available, it is plain that freeholders, to any extent, cannot be established in this country. He's saying that freeholders cannot be established. He's making two important points here. One, the thoroughness that sugar dominated. And second, he is seeing no hope for the smallholders. Of course, we know, as time went on, smallholders got land, they were able to establish themselves as independent cultivators and small farmers, and some even growing sugarcane as well. But in 1842, the point remains, sugar thoroughly dominated the landscape. We fast forward again to 1926. Vincent Harcrow, in his History of Barbados 1625 to 1685, writes about Barbados. He visits the country, and this is what he wrote in 1926. Every available foot of ground, with its black volcanic soils and reddish clay from the ocean floor, is carefully cultivated. Fringing the beach are coconut trees, leaning this way and that, behind and above groves of tall, straight stem palms, orange, lemon, breadfruit, and other tropical trees. But, he says, the feature that chiefly makes for this garden appearance is that of green sugar canes, clothing the rising terraces row by row. This is Vincent Harcrow, 1926. Now, let us look, therefore, at how sugar dominated. We've heard from the travel writers. Let us look at how this land was divided. Barbados has a total of 106,470 acres. 106,000 acres we are working with. Sugar occupied the black soils of the St. George Valley. That is the main, continues today to be the main area for sugar cultivation, even up to today. But in the period under consideration, it also extended to the red soils of the Central Plateau. Places like Clayberry, where you find those red soils, St. John, etc. And thirdly, the Scotland soils. So you have three distinct areas of sugar cultivation. First, the St. George's Valley, the red soils of the Central Plateau, and thirdly, the Scotland soils. So that when analysis was carried out on the productivity of the sugar plantations, they always made reference to the red soils estates, the black soils estates, and of course the Scotland soils estates. I spoke earlier about cotton. Cotton, ginger, and indigo were reserved for the coastal areas, and I'm sorry I didn't have a map, but I was trying to get one to show this graphically. Reserved for the coastal areas of St. Lucie, as well as the southeast coastlines of Christchurch and St. Philip. So you'll find cotton, ginger, indigo. During the slavery period, those crops were grown in that region. For example, at Fortescue Estate in St. Philip, there was an indigo plant set up there at Fortescue that went out of production around 1750, an indigo plant. Then the Earl of Hayward took over Fortescue, a plantation of over 241 acres. Cotton, according to Hilary Beckles in his Britain's Black Death, cotton was the main production at Fortescue. So that throughout the period, we have not only sugar exports, but Barbadians are exporting cotton, they're exporting indigo up to 1750, they're exporting aloes and ginger, but sugar dominates. Now when we look at the plantations, the number of plantations, you see sugar's dominance. 508 estates in 1942. It is reducing, but some of this is amalgamation. Some of this also is the peasantry eating into this estate ownership. But you see the number of estates, and they tell a story of about estate dominance in the period up to 1966, where there were still 242 estates. Let's go to the other slide, which talks about the acreage on the sugar, both in 1929 and 1960. 35,000 acres cultivated by the plantations, 1929. 15,000 acres by peasant farmers. And they're peasant farmers in Barbados in this period who are renting land from plantations as well at 10 pence per week. Some of them are renting land, and they too caught the fever to plant sugarcane on their small plot of land. And my father had two pieces, perhaps as big as these two columns here, and he also planted sugar cane on that land. So that you have thousands of small farmers who are also in sugar cultivation. In 1962, the Farley Commission, looking at the sugar industry, chaired by Professor Rawle Farley, recommended that the expansion of sugar lands should be confined. He says, and I quote him, "It would not be wise for Barbados to allow sugar production to expand beyond the present limits in the coming decades." He says the tonnage of cane required for production should be grown on as small an acreage as possible, thus freeing some of the land now under sugar for alternative uses. This reorganization envisages a system of mixed farming, not only for the country as a whole, but on an individual farm basis. And it says a dairy industry should be built up as an integral part of the economics of sugar production. So Farley was making an important point, this Farley Commission. He said, look, let us confine that area of sugar production. And let us see whether some of the land could be freed up for alternative agriculture. And he stresses here the dairy industry. Now this is 1962, the Farley Commission. So that by 1962, therefore, you have a situation where this commission is saying, look, let us move towards alternative agriculture. Now I want to move quickly on to the main issues for today. To answer that question about sugar's dominance. Why did sugar dominate for such a long period of time? And I want to make a few points. First of all, sugar dominated for over 300 years because of the persistent British demand for sugar and imperial support for it, for the industry. So on one hand, you have a demand for the product, but a demand to do what? Sugar was needed for tea. But moreover, sugar, raw sugar, what we call muscovado, was needed for further refining. In the slavery period, the Barbadians produced two types of sugar. They produced raw muscovado, and they produced another sugar they call clayed sugar. By mixing a little clay and water, pouring it into the sugar pots, and allowing it to drain for about 4 months. That was what they call semi-refined sugar. But the British demand was really for the raw sugar that they could refine and sell to the entire world, and sell back the Caribbean at a higher price. So we have the demand for tea, for sugar for tea, the demand for refining, and we also have a demand for rum for the Navy. Rum for the Navy, and rum for Englishmen as well. That's why there was a demand. Rum was needed in the Navy. Sailors needed a half a pint, they call it a grog, every day. And that kept their spirits high on the high seas. And Englishmen imbibed freely. Not only Englishmen, but Americans as well. As a matter of fact, during the slavery period, you have a vibrant rum trade to the 13 continental colonies. And there's also evidence of a trade from Barbados, a direct trade in the 1660s to Africa, where rum was exchanged for slaves. But we have, therefore, that persistent demand. So sugar dominates because of that demand, and that demand continues throughout the 300-year period under consideration. Besides this demand, there is persistent imperial support for the industry. For example, in 1834, when slavery is abolished by imperial legislation, the slave owners get $20 million compensation. The Barbados share was 1.7 million pounds. 1.7 million pounds. But in addition to that, sometimes we overlook the other things that Barbadians got, or the other things that the slave owners got. The slave owners got 4 extra years of apprenticeship. So that even though slavery was abolished in 1834, the formerly enslaved blacks had to serve another 4 years. And that has to be factored in to the compensation being granted to the slave owners. In addition to that, on top of that, the 1834 legislation does not rupture the sugar industry. It does not pull apart the plantations. The plantations remain firmly intact. So the 1st of August, 1838, the plantations keep running. There's no rupture. And perhaps the biggest part of that there's no compensation in terms of land for the freedmen. So we have a landless emancipation for the workers. So there's imperial support in terms of that juncture of emancipation. Throughout the period of the 19th century, as sugar ran into difficulties, Britain sends down various commissions to investigate what is happening in the sugar industry. At various times, we have an 1842 commission or select committee, another 1848 committee, another commission in 1896, 1897, that's the Norman Commission. There's another commission in 1930, meeting to discuss the sugar industry. The Moyne Commission also deals with the sugar industry. And the point here is to give the planters a hearing. Let them vent their grievances. We will offer some recommendations. At least, in some regard, Britain identifies with their problems and offers a few solutions. As a matter of fact, the 1930 Commission did not see any alternative to sugar. Lord Oliver, as chairman, said, and I quote, "In Barbados, there does not appear to be any alternative crop to take the place of sugarcane and provide employment for the dense population. But in some localities," he says, "areas could undoubtedly be planted with food crops to maintain an ample supply of foodstuffs." So this commission supports the view that sugar ought to continue, but says, look, let us find some areas where we can plant food. In 1902, Britain gave West Indian planters what they were always asking for when the bounties or the bounty-fed beet sugar was abolished. Those bounties abolished, the carbine planters were able to breathe easier. Beet sugar had competed fiercely from 1874 right down to 1902 with West Indian cane sugar and cane sugar from other sources because of heavy subsidies given by Germany, Austria, and France. And Britain intervened and said, enough is enough. And Chamberlain, Joseph Chamberlain, is said to be responsible for that intervention, and that is why we have a bridge today called Chamberlain Bridge. Also in that period, the Barbadian planters got some funding to support the capitalization of the industry. The West Indies got £80,000. Out of that, the Barbadians got some $384,000 in which they set up the Sugar Industry Agricultural Bank. Very important institution to keep the plantations going. Very important institution. So that by 1962, there were in that year, some 83 planters borrowing money from the Sugar Industry Agricultural Bank. 83 planters. And their average was $26,000 per loan. The point that I'm making here is that British intervention helped Barbadian planters to capitalize their plantations and to provide working capital for their plantations. And of course, we come right down to 1950 with the Commonwealth Sugar Agreement, which provided a guaranteed market for more than 80% of sugar, West Indian sugar, at a fair or what is called a negotiated price. So the point that we're making here is that sugar survived and did well because of imperial support. Secondly, sugar dominated because of the express actions of the planter elite, the actions of the planter merchant elite. The planters, of course, benefited as producers. But what about the merchants? The merchants also benefited because they exported the planters' sugar, exported the planters' rum, and some of them ended up with plantations. So when you look at R&G Challoner, an exporter of rum, molasses, an exporter of sugar. We look at DeCosta, a huge exporter. So we have, therefore, a situation where the planters and merchants dominate the island's institutions, political institutions. They dominate in the assembly, they dominate in the council, the legislative councils, and they make sure that the industry is kept afloat. For example, in Barbados, in the 1840s, land sells at between £60 and £125 per acre. The highest in the British West Indies. Perhaps we have followed this trend, and perhaps that's why it is so high today. But that was to keep land out of the hands of the freedmen. Then they set up the Court of Chancery to prevent those fallen estates from being cut up and subdivided. And then the innovations after 1900, innovations in the field and factory. Central factories come on stream. There are innovations in the field as well. So the planters look out for the industry. The merchants look out for the industry because that was their livelihood. That was their prime means of getting an income. Thirdly, sugar dominated because of its capacity to provide lucrative byproducts. And it is the one crop that you could process that gives you two very lucrative byproducts in molasses and rum. This is an image of the fermentation vat at Mount Gay, St. Lucie. The point here about rum manufacture is that throughout the period of slavery, the planters made sure or targeted rum to pay for what they call their running expenses. So sugar was a profit. Rum paid for their running expenses, their local expenses. So we see that. Go to the next slide. Next two. Next one. Well, this is still here, but this is the slide. Now, this is Turnasol. And in my master's thesis, which I did on the history of the rum industry under the supervision of Professor Woodville Marshall, Sir Woodville, and I thank him immensely for his input, as well as the late Peter Campbell. What you are seeing here is that this is the value of sugar, value of rum. These are the expenses. And in this year, 1779, rum fully covered those expenses. Here is 1775. You have rum accounting for 94% of the expenses. And that is how the planters work their plantation, making sure that rum covered the expenses. Now, there were times at River Plantation and Codrington when the planters made more rum than sugar. And that was the time when war existed. In time of war, the Navy comes in, the ships comes in, a whole fleet comes in, you make more rum. Because the Navy men have a demand for this grog. Okay? And sometimes some unscrupulous attorneys would make more rum as well and keep some of the profits of the rum. Now, this is in the 1770s. Next slide. It is much the same. Actually, it improves. It improves in the 1940s. Note in the 1770s, Barbadians hardly exported molasses because they kept their molasses and turned it into rum. There was a demand in North America, in Boston, for molasses. Boston had over 118 distilleries hungry for molasses, but the Barbadians turned their molasses into rum. But here, in the 1940s, what is called fancy molasses is a big exporter, especially for Canadians. They could put it on their waffles and pancakes, etc. So, in terms of the value, therefore, of the products, rum takes third place. Sugar first, molasses, then rum. Of course, today, that has changed. We're not an exporter of molasses anymore. We are a bigger exporter of rum. And we make more money I'm told these days, for rum than we make from sugar. But the point remains is that because of the product, because sugar produced two critical byproducts, the planters decided to keep it and never look for any alternative. This was what they were going to do, regardless of what conditions faced them. Next slide. And that brings me to the fourth point. That sugar cultivation was what the Barbadian planter knew best. The Barbadian planter had a knowledge of the cultivation of sugar, production, export, but not only that, he had invested huge sums in capital, in terms of buildings, in terms of equipment, and it was very difficult to change, very difficult to change. So therefore, we would expect that in this 300-year period, sugar to dominate. And it brings us therefore to our third section. The impact of sugar's dominance. It is clear that when we analyze the period, that sugar produced a wealthy and a dominant planter class, along with a merchant group. It is said that King George of Britain saw a carriage riding, and when he was told that it belonged to a West Indian planter, he said, "Sugar, sugar, all that sugar." That carriage was more magnificent than his. And he could not understand. He was bemused that a West Indian planter could parade his wealth, and he wasn't even a king. One writer, George Mellellen, in his book, Some Phases of Barbadian Life, written in 1909, had this to say about the Barbadian planter. He says, nowhere in the West Indies, nowhere on the face of the globe, in fact, is there a counterpart of the big sugar planter of Barbados. Perhaps the nearest to him is the English squire of ye olden time. And there is rather more than a suspicion that the country gentleman of Old England is the Barbados sugar planter's ideal and model. In other words, the country gentleman, according to this writer, might have modeled the Barbadian planter. And there are a few planters who stand out. We have Sir Graham Briggs, who owned Farley Hill, had a townhouse at Henderson, and also bought some 15 estates in Nevis in 1860. Next slide. We have the Piles. 1920, George Pyle inherits these plantations, Boarded Hall, 318 acres, you can see them there. A total of 2,887 acres for the Piles. But no, there's something significant about Pyle's ownership. He owns the plantations in the black soil area. the St. George's Valley, the deepest soils. As a matter of fact, even with this construction boom, it has yet to touch this aspect of the St. George's Valley. Plantations still abound in that area. Powell was also the part owner of Clareberry and was the attorney for the Hayward plantations. So what we're saying here is that sugar produced these sugar magnates. And the next slide shows you these grandiose houses, Nicholas Abbey, that we admire so much today. So that's its impact, creating wealth and creating this legacy too that we could benefit from. But it also led to a chronic dependence on foreign imports. When the planters cultivated most of their land in sugar, they decided to import their peas and their flour and their codfish, their rice from the 13 continental colonies, and of course, from Britain as well. But that created problems during the American Revolution. It is said that the price of flour after 1776 rose from 15 shillings per hundredweight to 30 shillings per hundredweight. Corn rose from 3 shillings per bushel to 10 shillings per bushel after 1776. And the enslaved population declined from 68,000 to 57,434. What we have here was a serious problem during the American Revolutionary War. Shortages being created. And it repeated itself in 1862-63 during the American Civil War, where shortages were created, leading to the 1863 riots in Barbados. Now, the other slide shows the picture that continues. We have a continuing picture of the excess of imports over exports. Continuing picture, where you import more than you export. And if we were to go down today up to 2014, we will see the same thing happening. So this discussion tells us that for over 300 years, we've been importing more than we export. When will it stop? Thirdly, how much time I have? 10 minutes? Good. Thirdly, sugar, even though the planters did not want to admit it, stunted manufacturing. It retarded the growth of manufacturing in Barbados. And you can see why. First of all, the planters did not want to sponsor any manufacturing enterprises in the 1940s, sorry. So when you look at what Crawford was saying, Winter Crawford, in Parliament, and he's calling for manufacturing industries to be set up. He's calling for concessions in the 1940s, and the planters are stalling. And they're stalling because they did not want to lose that solid labor force that they had to another enterprise. They wanted to keep labor for the sugar industry and keep a large pool of labor so that they could pay low wages. Secondly, manufacturing might have made labor scarce and expensive. The planters did not want that. And thirdly, in terms of the merchants, because of their ties to the sugar industry, they did not want local manufacturing to compete with their imports, where the goods are marked up, sold to the provincial merchants, who in turn sell to the shopkeepers. So there is resistance to manufacturing, there's resistance to industry, and there's even resistance to the oil industry. When you read the petroleum debate of 1950, where the British are saying that all of those oil-bearing lands should be vested in the Crown. George Pyle and John Chandler, yes, they are in on this debate, and they're saying, look, this is unfair, that oil is going to displace sugar. And not only displace sugar, but break up the sugar plantations, disturb the sugar plantations. So there's this heated petroleum debate in 1950. Fourthly, sugar bred poverty in the Caribbean and in Barbados. Eric Williams had this to say. He says, strange that an article like sugar, so sweet and necessary to human existence, should have occasioned such crimes and bloodshed. And that is why there are books by the name, that goes by the name like this, Sweet Meal Factor. Then there's another book on Cuba, Sugar is Made with Blood. So there's this link between sugar and poverty, sugar and crime. Something so sweet, but yet so sour for the masses. When you look at the sugar industry in Barbados, you have the workers being paid for 100 years approximately 1 shilling a day. For 100 years, the wages hardly increase. Not only that, you have a wage rent system that ties the worker to the plantation. When you look at some of those plots that were used by peasant farmers, trees have now taken the place of the cane fields. And I know my little area in St. George where the peasant farmers have died, the children have either migrated or have their university degrees and are no longer interested in the peasant farms. And I must confess that my father left some land for us and it has ran away, not in grass, but in trees. But that's a worrying factor. Even more worrying is this preference of Barbadians to plant grass rather than to plant that little kitchen garden that Barbadians of old used to plant. So we have a situation where every month the grass grows up, you have to spend $60 or $70 getting somebody to mow down the lawn. But it looks good. It looks good, but perhaps you could be cooking your food, as I did last Sunday. I went out into the garden and got some thyme and carrots, etc. And I felt very proud putting those things that I grew in my backyard in the pot. Thank you very much.